Thank you very much. I'm happy to follow your presentation. I want to thank the organizers and hosts and also acknowledge the role in this presentation of Matthew Carney, who's a graduate student in political science at the University of California, San Diego, and our division of labor is that he presented the paper elsewhere and I get to present it here. But I do want to acknowledge his role and thank him at this great distance for it. I'm going to talk about routes toward democracy in Latin America. The title is Interrupted Journeys. The focus is about transitions. We made a reference yesterday to the transition literature and a famous article by Thomas Carruthers saying, let us forget the transition paradigm. I have a somewhat different view. Carruthers told us what not to do, which is not to assume that if you have made a move in a democratic direction, you're going to end up in democracy. That's fairly simple to do. But he didn't take the next step, which is to trace movements all the way from authoritarianism toward democracy. In fact, the transitions literature is about getting out of authoritarianism rather than getting to democracy. So our task is to try to trace the steps and the routes by which Latin American countries go various distances in the direction of democracy. We will first present a typology of regimes, an overview of transitions. We'll talk about the qualities of some of the regime characteristics that we see, and then focus on pathways and interpretive discussion. The central question for us is, how do you get toward a liberal democracy? I'll define that term later, but not just any kind of democracy, but a liberal democracy, or what we might call it. So we begin with mapping regimes, what we call political cartography. And here we present a typology of political regimes based on two dimensions. One is the character of elections. Were there no elections? Were there fraudulent elections? Openly authoritarian elections? Were there free and fair elections, what we would call democratic elections? Or what I call semi-democratic elections that are free but not fair. Anybody can run, but only one guy can win. This is well known in Latin America, and in the case of Mexico, for example. The other dimension that we speak of is citizen rights. Now, this captures a broad range of rights. It's freedom to join political organizations or political parties or labor unions. It's freedom of the press. It's freedom of speech, choice of religion, freedom to move around the country, freedom to change occupations, etc. A whole battery of freedom from torture, freedom from unreasonable imprisonment or incarceration, and, so to speak, that trust in legal institutions, that you will have an impartial application of the law. So this basket of things we call citizen rights that can either be minimal or limited or expansive. For shorthand, we use this dimension of character of elections to define our regimes, and the citizen rights defines the character or quality of the regimes. We can discuss this if you'd like, but because I only have 17 minutes left, I'm going to hurry on through the remainder of the presentation. I would like to mention a terminological question. We use the language of transitions, but I'm personally increasingly uncomfortable with it because of what Carruthers wrote and others. This transition means something kind of a movement from authoritarianism, kind of in a democratic direction. I'd like to be a little more precise. I will now use a transition from any one cell in our typology to another cell. We'll call it a move or a switch or a change. A movement across electoral systems will be a change of regime. A movement within these electoral systems is a change within a regime. And democratization is really a sequence of moves or changes that results in democracy, either liberal or illiberal. A liberal democracy, just to come back to our typology, is one where citizen rights are expansive and there are free and fair elections. Chile is a good example. An illiberal democracy, as defined by Fareed Zakaria in Foreign Affairs about a decade ago and by others, is where you have free and fair elections but systematic constraints on citizen rights. Right? There are constrictions. Now, clearly, if you have free and fair elections, it's unlikely you will have unmitigated repression. So this is a null cell. If you have expansive, if you have no elections at all, it's very unlikely that you will have expansive citizen rights. So we have 2 null cells, 2 extreme polar cells, and a total of 7 categories. And what we try to do here is to map movements across these cells and to trace the frequency and the durability of the switches that take place. Okay? So that's the goal of this enterprise. And I'd like simply to flag and acknowledge the terminological questions that we raise. Now, in elections, I say personal evaluation. I wasn't there all the time. I'm old enough to have been there in all elections in Latin America since the mid-1970s, but I wasn't there. But I mean, you know, a series of observations about level of turnout, the closeness of the election, whether there were complaints or charges of fraud, whether the elections were accepted. It's a qualitative judgment that we make on the basis of secondary literature, some original data, and frankly, our judgment as to whether the elections that took place were free and fair. The category for citizen rights we take from Freedom House scores on a dimension they call civil liberties. They have a reverse scoring system. So 1 is very good and 7 is very bad. So 1 or 2 we call expansive civil liberties. 3 or 4 or moderate or medium, and 5 to 7, there are very few cases of 7, except Freedom House applies it to Cuba. Typically, it's a little ideological. And at some points in the Pinochet period, they gave it Pinochet 6 or 7, and Haiti in the early 1990s. It's rarely applied, the 7. So it's 5 or 6, really. So we take the Freedom House scores and categorize them according to our 3 dimensions. So you get an example like Mexico, which in our categories would thus come as a moderate non-democracy. It was not hardline, not hardline like Pinochet, hard enough, but moderate, roughly speaking, from the late 70s to 1987. The election of 1988, I would call semi-democratic. There were a number of real candidates, but it was clear that only Salinas was going to win. They closed down the computers to make sure that that happened. And they even rigged the vote total so it looked kind of democratic, although in my view it was not. But it was so therefore it was a semi-democracy that was not liberal because there were systematic constraints. It got a score of 3 or 4 from Freedom House on civil liberties. It then became an illiberal democracy with the election of Vicente Fox. It moved from a semi-democracy to democracy, but was still illiberal in the first full year of Vicente Fox's government. Then, partly under his opening, became a liberal democracy for several years, and since 2006 a move backwards towards illiberal democracy because of the violence associated with drug wars, the impunity of the police repression of human rights, etc. So Mexico moves back. But that's just an example of how we apply these categories. The appendix that is distributed in the paper is incomplete. It's about half the countries. The full paper has all of the countries, so we apologize for that. That's simply a mechanical error, but nonetheless, we show in the appendix all of the countries and how they come off in the scoring system. So, now let's look at transitions, what I call aerial photography, looking at it from above. A quick overview, particularly for those of you who, for whom this information on Latin America is relatively new, as the information on Poland is totally new for me. In a nutshell, Latin America had, I would say in the 20th century, 3 spurts of electoral democracy. I'm not speaking of quality of democracy, just free and fair elections. There was a brief spurt in the 1910s to the 1930s, usually a very small number of countries, mostly in the southern cone, Argentina particularly. Mexico for 1 year, 1911, Francisco Madero, and then he was out, but you know, if you grant that. But sort of a small kind of ripple, not a wave, of democratic elections before the Second World War, and then what I think of as an M-shaped wave in the 1940s through the 70s, a surge of electoral democracies during and after World War II. Then there was a sharp decline in the early 50s and then a rise again. I think of that as an M-shaped curve. And then most recently, the current trend, which we here plot back from 1972. You can see the end of the downturn here in the early 1970s, the Chilean coup, the Uruguayan coup, etc., falling in these periods, pushing down. This is number of countries with or living under free and fair elections or under semi-democratic elections. So that the number went down in the early 1970s and began to climb in the late 1970s, according to my coding, in Ecuador and Peru in the late 70s, and then moved through the rest of South America. So this surge of democratization in Latin America through 2008 really dates back to the late 1970s and includes, for countries with democratic elections, by the year 2008, 16 or 17 countries out of 19 or 20. A lot. With some semi-democratic elections as well taking place in other countries. So this has been quite a groundswell. It's been quite consistent. And the continent remains under, for the most part, the rule of democratic elections, but not necessarily liberal polities. When we segregate or divide the quality of democracies in Latin America according to citizen rights, respect for citizen rights, we see a sharp distinction. That is, those countries that get Freedom House scores of 1 or 2, really good, expansive citizen rights, are liberal democracies. Those countries get 3 or higher, are illiberal democracies. What is the outcome? You know, we are told in much political science that if you get free and fair elections, everything else is going to follow. I don't think so. What we see here is that by far there are some liberal democracies, and that there was a flat number of 3 or 4 through the 1990s, and then a bump up to about 5 or 6. But that's where it is as of 2008. By far the greatest number of democracies and the greatest type of polity in Latin America has become illiberal democracy. Free and fair elections and systematic constraints on citizen rights. That combination. Not totalitarian repression of citizen rights, but systematic constraints that kind of make these democracies incomplete and restricted in a variety of ways. Okay, so this is the empirical data. What we want to see now is what these regimes look like, and then talk about the transitions or the paths to get towards either illiberal or liberal democracy. Okay? So, what are the most common types of regimes in Latin America since 1978 through the year 2008? Well, just very quickly, you can see, yes, over 60% of the country years in Latin America during this span. Okay, we're counting not countries, but country years. Over 60% of the country years, nearly 2/3, are democratic. But over 40% were illiberal democracies. By far the dominant mode in this current cycle of democratization in Latin America is illiberal democracy. And there's no teleological assumption necessarily that illiberal democracies will become liberal democracies. Why not? Well, let's look at 2 measures of stability or durability of regimes. If you simply skip this for now. But if we compare illiberal and liberal democracies in terms of average lifespan of these regimes, democracies, yes, they have an average lifespan of about 10 years so far. But illiberal democracies, let's just say it's as durable as liberal democracies. Right? In fact, the data a little bit higher, but I wouldn't make much of a case about that. So their durability in terms of lifespan is very real, which helps explain why, in terms of country years, they are the dominant mode. If we compute stability in another way, what is the likelihood of an exit from your category, either in a democratic, more democratic, or a less democratic direction? What is the likelihood of some kind of exit? Well, you can see for hardline non-democracies, you know, the instability index is the proportion of exits of one kind or another for all country years in that category. So, of all hardline non-democratic years, about 24%, the likelihood of an exit was 0.24. The likelihood of a staying in was 3 out of 4. Not so bad. Mm-hmm. Better than moderate regimes. If you soften the regime, it's going to be more vulnerable than if you keep it hard, I'm sorry to say. These intermediate categories are a little different. I'll skip them for now. But simply to say again that illiberal democracies, if we compute either their likelihood of instability, exit, or stability, retention, is the same as liberal democracy, 94%. So no matter which way you measure it, they are as durable as liberal democracies. They are not a fluke, right? They're not a simply figment of my imagination. There's something going on in the Latin American polities. So let's try to trace pathways. How have countries moved across this checkerboard that we gave earlier of the 7 categories where you can move in one or another kind of direction, okay? What we did here was to compute the probability per country year of a transition from one, these are group categories, to another. Okay, so what this, let me go to the next figure first and then come back to this one. This figure here is simply the raw probability. It's not per country year, but if you're in the category, if you move, what is the likelihood that you move in a certain direction? So hardline democracies, their most likely move, if they make a move, is to a moderate non-democracy. They don't jump all the way to liberal democracies, hardly ever. If you're a moderate non-democracy and you make a move, the most likely path is to go to a restrictive semi-democracy. Semi-democracies tend to cluster in this mode. Repressive semi-democracies are much less numerous than restrictive middle category semi-democracies, and permissive semi-democracies don't last very long. It's a contradiction to have a fraudulent election and expansive civil rights. Right? So what happens is you either restrain the civil rights and go in this direction, or you move in this direction to an illiberal democracy. That is, you free up the elections. The logical path, or the most frequent path from restrictive semi-democracy, is to illiberal democracy, and here we see movements back and forth. How do you get to a liberal democracy? The most likely path is through illiberal democracy. Okay. We did the same calculation in terms of country years. That is, what is the likelihood of a movement per country year among group categories? And the findings are a little simpler to explain, right? If you're in a non-democratic category, you're likely to move to a semi-democracy or an illiberal democracy. In a semi-democracy, you might move back to non-democracy or to illiberal democracy. The most likely path to liberal democracy is through illiberal democracy. If you're a liberal democracy, if you go anywhere, your most likely path is back to illiberal democracy. That is, am I already short on time? Okay. So these are kind of the structural paths
3 minutes.
that our analysis shows. Okay, so there are certain kind of patterns and tendencies that we have picked up in a statistical way. And now, so to interpret the data, 0.033 means that if you're in this category per country year, there's likely to be one transition in that direction every 30 country years. Right, just to get a sense of what the numbers look like. We can come back to that later. But believe me, the arrows show you what you need to know. Okay. So what we then wanted to do was say, okay, we've got these statistical models. It looks nice. Maybe a little hard to explain and hard to understand on first exposure. Let's see where countries fit in these categories. So we looked at 2 general patterns. One is routes toward liberal democracy, countries that end up where you want them to end up. How do they actually get there? Well, there are a couple of patterns here. Only 2 countries went direct from non-democracy to liberal democracy, Ecuador and Uruguay. 2 countries went via very, very brief pathways through 1 year of illiberal democracy. So these countries, as both A and B, went very quickly, right, from a non-democratic situation to a liberal democracy. How did they do that? What do these countries have in common? Well, they all have a durable democratic past. It was predictable. You knew what you were going to get when you moved to a democratic system. In Argentina, the Peronistas and the Radicales were the same. They negotiated with the Peronistas because they thought they were going to win, and they had it all worked out. Well, Radicales won the election in 1983, but, with no big change in the landscape. Uruguay, it's the same political parties, the same unions, okay? Everybody knew everybody. Even Ecuador has a tradition that went back to 1948, and a military regime that kind of was in league with civilian forces. So it was very predictable. Everybody knew what was going to happen and what the parameters were. In the cases of Brazil, Mexico, and Panama, it's more complicated. They all had lengthy authoritarian periods. There was a lot of uncertainty about who the democratic players might be, and a lot of negotiation and renegotiation along the way through semi-democracy and then illiberal democracy, finally getting to liberal democracy in the case of Brazil. So that was a different, much a slower pattern that went through kind of negotiation and trial periods. What about the countries that ended up in illiberal democracy, that never got to liberal democracy? What do they have in common? Well, those that went direct from non-democracy, Bolivia, Ecuador in its very difficult contemporary period, Haiti particularly, what do we find there? Very explicit bargains and pacts, right? And the bargain was, you're going to have a liberal democracy, right? You can vote for whoever you want, right? But we're going to constrain the outcome by systematic constraints on citizen rights. There are going to be some parameters here. Other countries went through non-democracy to semi-democracy, that is rigged elections, to illiberal democracy, free and fair elections and restricted rights. What do these countries have in common? Well, aside from the fact that most of them are in Central America, they had no democratic experience. This was a novel experiment. You had no idea what was going to come when you sort of opened the possibility of democratic competition. So this was a period of a stage of confidence building, experimentation. Semi-democracy turns out to be a convenient exit for authoritarian rulers, but it doesn't last very long. Rigged elections just don't last very long in the contemporary environment. There was no reversion. Once you were in an illiberal democracy, no reversion to semi-democracy. Illiberal democracy is common in Latin America now. Why? To me, it's a grand compromise. Right? It's a compromise between insurgent forces that want a kind of democratic political system and sort of societal power groups and elite groups that really are very suspicious about this. So there's this bargain. There will be elections and there will be constraints. And that this bargain shows in effect, just to make one last point. I know. Okay. Mm-hmm. Let me just make the point here, that illiberal democracy turns out to be the most convenient historic compromise. It's not just a stepping point. It's not just a pathway. It's a system, and it's a system that has its logic, and that shows to me, in a surprising way, the ways in which societal typical elites and conservative forces can allow free and fair elections to take place and still impose constraints on the possibility of social change. These democracies are not, until the recent pink wave under Chavez, they were not trying to bring about major change. There can be reversions as well, as the case of Honduras last week shows. 1/3 of all of the transitions that we studied are in a non-democratic direction. So let us dispense with the transition paradigm, as Carruthers said, but let's look clearly at what kind of transformations and changes are going on see what patterns we can detect, and then finally how we might explain them.
Right, thank you for summing up the end there. Let's start people think of questions. I have a question first, and then we'll take it. In terms of categories and typologies, your illiberal democracy, which is obviously always the key, the modal pattern, am I right that other political scientists have something similar to that, like low-intensity democracy, or is yours significantly different? That's one conceptual question. And then the specific question about Mexico, I can't resist asking that one, which I mentioned to you on the way, which is, Mexico has recently reverted, you say, around 2006, from a liberal democracy, which it was for about 5 years, back to being an illiberal democracy. Your reason, and I guess this probably was the argument, is that it has to do with violence, particularly narco-violence. It's not quite clear to me why that would have that effect. I mean, your definition of what constitutes citizens' rights doesn't say anything about the chances of getting shot or mugged. I mean, the chances of that happening in Brazil are quite high, but I think Brazil qualifies as a liberal democracy in your book. I have no argument with that. It seems to me you're... isn't there a sort of, aren't you slightly importing a set of categories there, or at least explain to me why that factor should be so crucial as to flip you from one box to another?
Well, I think the case of Mexico, just to take that, it's not so much it's not just the violence, but the impunity of police violence, the level of corruption, the sort of degradation of the judicial system and of the police system, and the infractions of human rights. I mean, that is a central part of this definition. I will concede that the notion of citizen rights is broad. Okay, it's a little fluffy in certain ways. We could have, but we wanted to simplify it, get a parsimonious explanation, right? So I think you'll find in some cases it might have to do with putting journalists in jail. In some other cases it might have to do with banishing professors. In some other cases it might have to do with a legal system that simply doesn't function. In some other cases it might have to do with a police that's shooting people indiscriminately. I'm also, the backup is, well, I'm using Freedom House scores, so that's the case. Well, there's a lot of discussion about Freedom House scores, and we can come. Let me just make one observation. Yes, these categories will look like some others. The virtue of this, I think, is that it's fairly straightforward and it's comprehensive. What we have, Larry, you'll agree, in the case of democracy, we've got 35 subtypes of democracy. In the case of authoritarianism, we've got 45 subtypes, and they're not consistent with each other. You can't talk across regimes. So one virtue of this, I would claim, is that it's very straightforward. There's room for disagreement about which country belongs where, but at an intuitive level, it makes a lot of sense. It doesn't capture everything, but it captures a lot, and it has the virtue of allowing you to look at the steps all the way from a hardline authoritarian regime to a liberal democracy.
Okay. Now, my question would be a direct. First and then Carl. Yes, my question would be a direct follow-up. I mean, in effect, I love your analysis, but was really puzzled by its structure, because you have a perfect logic based on the premise that Freedom House scores are reliable for the measurement of citizen rights. Now, you're probably right. I mean, I'm certain your choice is a sound one, but could you tell us a little bit about Freedom House methodology?
Yes. Freedom House started producing scores in the early 1970s for countries around the world. It was really the brainchild of one hard, energetic worker, and it is now expanded to the point where there are teams that do country studies and reports. The scores are backed up by a very substantial series of essays now, so that it's not just kind of an arbitrary series of scores. It isn't perfect, but I think it's better than a lot of other alternatives. There's sort of these interval scale scores that go from -10 to +10 for the polity measures, if those of you who work them. It's all merged together. At least Freedom House, sorts out political rights versus civil liberties and provides a clear justification for why. We did a statistical analysis, and it's in the appendix that you'll see, of our findings versus several other kind of standard systems of analysis. The newest is a series of human rights data, and I thought, oh my God, this is going to kill us, right? That they have two dimensions of human rights, and you know, they're going to show that you just can't. And a lot of people don't like Freedom House. I mean, they think it's more ideological than it is. So what we did was compare our analysis to these two new human rights scores. We found that our results have a high correlation with both of them, and much higher than they have with each other. So if we're looking for a single summary measure, it's as good as any. It's not perfect, but I think much of the calumny that has been visited upon Freedom House is misplaced. It's better than polity, I would argue, because it segregates things. It explains very clearly what's going on. It now brings in a battery of experts to kind of support it. It isn't perfect. The critical thing I would say, if I were going to criticize this work, I'd say, look, you make a big distinction between a 2 and a 3. You know, what is the logic of that distinction? The logic, in part, is Freedom House's own distinction. If you're below 2.5, you're a democracy. If you're above 2.5, you're not. So for them, there's a qualitative jump between 2 and 3. I'm not assuming that this is an interval scale score, that the difference between 1 and 2 is the same as between 2 and 3 and between 3 and 4. I'm assuming and asserting on the basis of their statements that there are qualitative differences between a 2 and a 3 and between a 4 and a 5. And I think that's borne out. It's not perfect, but look, I wanted to get some handle that was not simply, you know, my cocktail conversation with friends. And and Freedom House, I mean, has gotten a very bad rap from hotshot political scientists who use polity and other things. I mean, you make your choice. People make a choice. I'd rather, the Freedom House scores have this version. They are given at the same time, real time. Polity is people using quantitative measures going back 100 years. Well, the quantitative data 100 years ago was lousy. And why should I believe that some guy and wearing a white coat combining these scores is going to get a better result than political observers with good faith making real-time judgments according to more or less what they hope are consistent categories. It isn't perfect, but I'd rather have smart guys making judgments at the time than technocrats making retroactive judgments on the basis of only quantitative data.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Question. Well, Freedom House, in a way, leads nearly to the US, especially the US as such, or 2 or 3 states. The United States figure on Freedom House is this. Second, turning to Jacek's paper, you seem to regret that you say some 80% of the people elected at the local level are not elected via parties. The systems I know, this is not, first it's not uncommon. In Germany this is a rather regular feature because there are not political questions but more technical issues. Other countries, which I happen to know, like Belgium, France, are not good examples because they lead to accumulation of such offices and even to less participation by the citizens, and as such, more easily to corruption. We have the case of priests, highly personalized. And then a question, you see in the last sentence, if I understood it right, you seem to be looking for modalities to improve the participatory rights of citizens. I'd like to see what modalities, in case you think about referendum, but only in case. I would, that's my daughter. In case you think of referenda, I would make some comments, but only then. Thank you.
I will wait with the answer.
Patricia, you want to ask
Yes.
a question?
Yes, I would like to. Do you think it's a very general question? Only if you have comments. How would you interpret the situation of Poland if you use your model?
I was going to ask, actually, I'd like to invite anybody who'd like to undertake some comparative work on this part of the world. Would be great. I mean, one virtue of this is that it's relatively simple to apply. And I think listening carefully to these presentations, you know, I think Poland would nowadays probably be a liberal
If I
democracy.
follow you, I would say in the way of illiberal democracy.
Yeah. To answer the other question about Freedom House, Freedom House is less reliable at the extremes, the ones and the sevens, right? It tends to give sevens to countries that we don't like, and tends to give ones to ourselves or to countries that we like. You know, there is a study forthcoming, I'm so happy to say, that treats by a political scientist the American South up until the Civil Rights Movement of the 1960s as an authoritarian regime. We're finally breaking down, you know, the ethnocentric tendencies in comparative politics and making U.S. comparative. That's a great move.
Does Guantanamo impinge on Freedom House's ranking in the United States?
Look, you know, I think there are serious reasons now for reassessing under the Patriot Act. I would have said it's an illiberal democracy, my own judgment. Now, Freedom House might not agree with me, but that's what I would have said.
Well, I'm going to answer, but first on the question. In fact, I realized the good question on part of Poles to you is, how would you define Cuba?
I would define Cuba. I would define it as a moderate dicta blanda.
The problem is, you know, we know what.
Yeah.
There is a little element missing in this typology. It's different. The Fidel brothers, well, like any brothers in politics, are not necessarily defining characteristics of the regime there. It's the party dictatura, which you do not have such category in your scheme. But answering your question, I didn't regret. I think I'm happy with the fact that. Did you use term regret?
Yeah,
No. I simply observe. Well, I don't think really that the party mechanisms are really of effective importance. And I didn't know about Germany. I know Netherlands is also a local level. It's one-party system. Well, but you see, my problem is with you gave Sartorian answer. That because at the local level there are technical problems, not political. Remember Sartori? He tells you that we need parliaments because they deal with technical issues that average citizen is unable to to understand. So the technical, what is political versus technical? Where is the
building new streets is not a political issue as such. It's a decision on a technical level.
Not in Poland.
Of course, building a new system of social security is technical in its content, highly political. That's what I mean.
But that opens the real debate, I think, on that.
Look, could I comment quickly? This accommodates party system. There's no reason. I don't mean the term dictadura to mean one person. I mean an authoritarian regime. So this accommodates party systems. There's no assumption here. I might say because that yes, I would agree. We have a fairly narrow definition of what is politics. That is, I don't mean to minimize some of the social and socioeconomic achievements of the Cuban Revolution. I don't. We're talking about the polity, in a relatively, you know, in a parsimonious sense. There are lots of other debates about social justice. If you don't have, you have so much income inequality, how can you have democracy and so on? I see those as relevant factors, but they're not defining the regime. So I simply wanted to make that point. This is, yes, a not quite minimalist, but a bounded definition of what politics is.
The problem is with party dictaturas is that you have, for instance, 10% of adult population who are dictators formally.
Okay.
Because they belong to the party.
Patricia, and anybody else?
Very short. I find very useful these typologies because we can compare with the same measures, with the same criteria, and we can try to discover tendencies and to explain, generalize then. And but my question is about the democratization in Europe. You didn't talk about the role of the parliament. The parliament. What about the parliament?
Well, that's a good question. Of course, you could write the whole book on. I did it myself on the role of parliament. Well, legislative role of parliament. But it does not mean that parliament plays autonomous role in democratization. Parliament is emblematico. It's you've got elected parliament, you are democrat, you pass the test. And that's the major
But
role
who control the agenda, the parliament or the executive?
Stempelowski, of course, he was sociology of parliament in brief. Okay, oligarchy. This is, of course, the club of party oligarchies.
Speed up, please.
Sorry? Well, this is, of course, the club of collaborating party oligarchies who's keeping control of so-called backbenchers, a term which is not necessarily to be used in our parliaments in Europe, but these less important MPs who are supposed to vote as the oligarchs say. This is how it works. So we've got representation which is ruled by small oligarchy of the parties who are supposed to be the transmission of our interest stuff. So the process is just, opposite in a sense to the classic model of assumptions of liberal democracy theory, normative theory.
Yes, Peter, I was thinking that maybe your typology could be more useful if it incorporated a third variable, such as institutional development. By which I mean, does the separation of powers work? I mean, this is a third variable that is really relevant in evaluating the degree to which a country has really become democratized, and which is totally absent here.
Well, it's smuggled in a little bit on the citizen rights and so on. Here's the thing. That's a choice. If you have another dimension, then you've got 21 more cells. I mean, so that
But for example, in Argentina, oftentimes laws are purchased through bribery. Okay, now this is a pretty big thing. I mean, in evaluating Argentine democracy, so maybe one could do with a few more cells.
Yeah. Well, I take your point. This could certainly, one can certainly complicate this, and I don't mean to minimize the point by saying it. This is what we're trying to do is a first key step. I would have to say I was very surprised. I did not expect that illiberal democracy was going to be as prevalent as it has been. I did not expect that. Secondly, I was surprised as an historian, ex-historian, to discover that one of the key factors, one of the key dimensions is historical memory and predictability, because if you're going back to a golden age of the past, it's much easier to accept that than if you're jumping off a cliff. Now, until we constructed those last two tables, I didn't have a clue what I was going to say here in Poland. But I think, the question in part for me is, have we made headway in an important sense. On the questions of corruption and bribery, we do have a subtype of semi-democracy. If someone is elected but doesn't govern, which is sort of what bribery is in this sense, then that's not a democratic election. The winner of a democratic election has to govern, has to have power. If it's in the American embassy, or if it's in the casinos, or if it's in, the Sociedad Rural, instead, that doesn't qualify by the way that we've set it up. Now, that doesn't quite answer the question, but if there were egregious cases, as there are, where corruption and bribery are really where the power lies, and it's not anything to do with an elected cosmetic president, then we can try to take that into account. But I think your point is very, very well taken. All I'd say is that this is a beginning step, and I'd have to say, for me, some of the results were surprising. I don't know about the rest of you, but I would not have anticipated this, and I think I'm encouraged.
It seems to be, looking at it historically, you could make 2 points. These are not questions. One is that Latin America, and this point was made yesterday as well, has had a very long tradition of something like democratic legitimacy in theory. And the notion that political sovereignty comes from the people, it doesn't come from the king or God or... That's bound up with the republican tradition going back to independence. Of course, the question then is, well, once you have popular sovereignty in elections, they're the only game in town theoretically, pretty much. But then you can manage it all manner of different ways, particularly to disenfranchise people. Obviously, women were disenfranchised for the greater part of the 200 years. We now are in a situation where regimes pretty much seem to have to accept a broad enfranchisement. I mean, no regime is likely to suddenly say, we'll have a property franchise or a male-only franchise, or you have to be over 35 to vote. And that does seem to be sort of consolidated. So there is a sense in which that is a kind of norm that's going to be difficult to break, probably globally as well as in Latin America. But then the second thing is, if you look at the period you're dealing with, and obviously it's probably a pretty good period to deal with, it's 30 years. So in a very long-term historical perspective, one might say, well, it's a feature of this particular time, this sort of generation, which is particularly bound up with not just the political changes, but certain economic changes too, which would include the liberalisation of economies, the Washington Consensus. Now, of course, we know that in the last, 10 years maybe, that's beginning to shift a bit. So the interesting thing would be, if we jump forward, we can't do, except a thought experiment, another 30 or 40 years, whether the paradigm and the typology, which looks very convincing, will change. Whether it's in some ways a paradigm that's contingent on a particular historical period or conjuncture. I mean, in particular, I'm thinking that if you ask you could replay this, going back to an earlier phase, earlier waves of democratization, why did they go wrong? Why did you start to get reversals? You could go from certainly a liberal democracy, or even a liberal democracy, right across back quickly to a dictadura. Why did that happen? Had a lot to do with, I think, social and economic tensions, economic crises, and polarizations, as in, say, Chile in 1973. Those have been sort of avoided, and I think they've been avoided partly for global economic reasons, etc. If they came back, if the current crisis spawned a great many, social protests, polarizations, etc., you might start to get big flippings going on, which we haven't had recently. I mean, that's not a criticism, that's just sort of thinking that as we advance in time through years and decades, your typology will still be useful, but it may be that the prevalence of illiberal democracy as a kind of modal pattern, that might start to change quite a bit.
Right. Just very, very briefly, to follow up your point, the democracies of the 1940s to the 1970s, in my view, were dangerous because they were really reformist. They all had very expansive social change platforms. So one of the lessons of this is we're not going to have that anymore. You can have elections, but we're not going to have that. So we're also getting now this new tendency of the so-called pink wave in Venezuela and elsewhere, which is a protest against the timidity of many of these democracies. And that's a drama to be undertaken. In this, I would categorize, by the way, Venezuela under Chavez comes out as a restrictive semi-democracy. there are elections, only one guy can win, and there are constraints. There really are constraints. But the ideological vertiente is very different. So what we may see within this, in addition to institutional development, is a kind of the need to incorporate an ideological dimension also.
Yes. I do like very much the attempt to classify and categorize the different and various stages of the process. Particularly if I read what I've seen right now in the context of your book on democratization in Latin America, which is the best publication of the science available. Now, what makes me uneasy about all that is the number of adjectives. The number of adjectives we need to describe those stages, you see, and they are value charged inevitably, you see. Illiberal, liberal, moderate, semi, and so on and so on. It's difficult to translate it into quantitative categories or criteria. So I'm asking myself, actually, wouldn't it be possible, for instance, somehow to deconstruct, as it were, certain names of those stages by using a very specific way of measuring the the enactment of certain rules and certain institutions and their application in practice. And for want of time, I can go on in such an abstract way, so I will give you an example. Several times references were made to the institution of the Parliament. So, if we would like to know, for instance, how the Parliament works in those various and different stages, at those stages, I would ask the following questions. How the scrutiny is organized. There's the supervision of the Parliament or the Council Minister or the President, if he's the executive, first. Second, who is proposing the agenda? We know that there's a big problem in Latin America that actually agenda is being proposed by the President, not by the political parties in the Parliament. Second, who is actually not enacting, but proposing and implementing the budget of the Parliament? Some people are surprised to learn that, for instance, in the oldest democracy in Europe, the budget of the House of Commons is being decided de facto by the Home Secretary, not by the Parliament itself. So then, who is appointing by the parliamentary services and who is controlling the services, you see? So if we enumerate such specific questions which are crucial to the functioning of any given institution, you see, then we can see how it works, because we can easily count. For instance, we have 5 criteria, 3 are all right, and in 2 cases we can't find anything which would respond to any notion of any democracy at all, and so on and so on. I would also ask similar questions with respect to the chief executive, because the chief executive in Mexico is something entirely different to the chief executive in Argentina. The presidency acts in a different way, and there is a richness of data amassed with respect to the European executive branch, the state power. So instead of using this semi-presidential, presidential, so with this value-charged adjectives, and we would have a series of very specific criteria which can be defined in a quantitative way. That wouldn't solve probably everything, but I think it might lead to a higher degree of adequacy, so to speak. And I think you're on the right way, but I would add this quantitative aspect with very specific questions related to the constitutional order in action, not only from the point of view of written law as enacted, but also implementation, also judiciary, law enforcement how to act. Law enforcement is from the point of view of the judiciary, not executive, not law enacting authority, which is the parliament, but the judiciary itself. For instance, in Poland, we have a perfect procedure in civil law and penal law. However, we have a discouraging number of statutes of limitations, which in practice means that you can't pass a verdict because the time has elapsed, and no longer given crime may be considered even or presented by the prosecution, state prosecutors to the court. Now, why is it so? Because the way the judges are appointed and supervised is imperfect, to put it mildly. So these are the specific questions which might help a lot to understand the contents of those categories, and thereby perhaps leading to slightly changing the categories, see, in light of those specific criteria. That's my idea.
One more quick, I think we'll have to, one more quick question, and then we'll open it up for the two speakers to say any concluding comments they want to make.
It's not even a question, just a humorous comment. The phase which is called illiberal democracy, I think, in Ecuador, 2001 to 2008, was in a confidential report by European ambassadors called the phase of institutional cannibalism. Institutional cannibalism.
It's not balconazo. It's then. No. Give me a balcony and I will become a president.
When all institutions declared the other one irregular, unconstitutional, and so on.
Does Professor Kraszewski, do you want to make any final?
I have not answered the second part of comment made by you. So, no, I'm not a prophet, and I don't want to exaggerate in the details of what I think is a future development, inevitable, though I think. Well, of course, referenda is old tradition, old model, and I think it's a pity we do not really study enough, and, well, the Swiss political history and practices, that's one thing. But I'm not, my laugh is not with a referendal paradigm, though what I used to take seriously all these warnings against plebiscitarian democracy and things like that. Especially, I didn't like so-called the term we use always speaking of these demagogues. In Polish, how we say?
Populist?
Populisti, yes. Well, I have some instinctive hatred of populisti. Though suddenly I realized that sometimes you find more populisti in parliament than on the street. Just to give you two examples. Well, long ago I used to visit Quebec. It was under old regime conditions, and well, I came to know Mr. The man Parizeau, Jacques Parizeau, who was leader of Péquiste, Québécois Party, and well, I used to discuss with them, and then I was following with sympathy the developments in Quebec, and generally my conclusion is that the society of Quebec was behaving more reflexive and moderate than politicians, professional politicians in Quebec. And in a sense, well, the whole problem was somehow transformed due to use of these various systems of electronic fora, commissions which traveled, open fora, this type of arrangements. Well, they look very boyish, one could say, but they worked. In Polish case, well, we've had that would be too much perhaps to come into details, but some of us here remember those days where Samo Obrona, well, was in parliament. Well, that was a very interesting case of so populist party, really new one after the 89, who went, you know, well, that was really a cavalcade what they did into the parliamentary life, and they left it. They were voted out by the nation, you know? And they were populists in parliament. Well, it was nice, just to give you one example, very telling. They used the time when they were parliamentarians to end their secondary educations or to study the extramural university courses, which I think for individuals is very healthy, though it shows you well what this so-called competent representation means in today's society. I'm afraid the populism is too often used as just a persuasive term to discard all non-parliamentarian attempts by public opinion to influence the public life. That's my...
But demos and populus are the same in different languages.
Peter, you have 1 minute. We'd like to sum up.
Yes, thank you. I appreciate the suggestions on ways to enrich and specify the criteria here. Let me just say first that we wanted categories rather than numbers, because if we're looking at stepping stones, we conceived of these as categorical variables. Each category has quantitative range within it, of course. But I take your point very seriously in the sense that we could imagine a numerical scale here and one here, and you could map with more precision, moving where you move, you know, from here to here to here to various points within the array. Our decision was to work with categorical variables. I take your point, and the ways to justify the categories also could be strengthened. It's certainly not strengthened, not explained in great length here. Let me simply make this point in contrast to the scales that are common in political science. I wanted very much to separate these dimensions. I didn't want to aggregate them, which is what most of these scales do. I wanted to separate the character of elections from citizen rights so that we could look in two-dimensional space at the relationship between them. That is at least one of the positions that we started with, and which creates the typology and allows us to proceed with the analysis. We could do it more precisely, I certainly grant you that. Whether we'd end up having created a quantitative scale, we'd fall back on thresholds is an empirical question, in a sense, and I certainly take the point, but thank you very much. We thought we knew what we were doing, but we'll take these questions and comments into very serious account. Thank you.
Right, thank you very much. Interesting discussion. We now move straight on to the last pair of papers. We'll have first Karl Buck on the European and Latin American integration projects.
Thank you.
You're going to use the
I'll
Okay, give me one. Sorry? Okay, I'm told people need a 5-minute break.